Hey guys, we are back with part 6 of House of Dark Shadows. Chapter 23, Saturday, 12:27 a.m. The curvy corridor lay before them. It was creepy and mysterious and oddly inviting. Both boys had stepped into the carpeted runner. It was soft and warm under Xander's bare feet. He forced himself to start walking. David clung to him like one of those remora fish that attach themselves to sharks. It made Xander feel like the big brother he was. When it came to tackling new adventures, David was fearless. As long as he knew others had trod before him and lived, he figured he could do it too. What spooked the kid was, well, spooky things: ghosts, vampires, dark shadows, mysterious noises, the unknown. My turn to be brave, Xander thought. They approached the the first light fixture. It was a small statue mounted on the wall, an old man whose long beard flowed into a tunic. A wreath crowned his head. He held open a book and pointed at a page. His eyes were cut out, allowing the light from the bulb within to shine through them. Xander recognized the style as of the carving of ancient Greek. Of One of the things about having a history teacher for a dad was you got a lot of history lessons. He suspected the man was Plato or Socrates or one of those other brainy sage types. The top of the lamp was open and light splashed up the wall in the shape of an ice cream cone. The ice cream scoop itself was a glowing circle on the ceiling. As they passed, Xander's eyes kept darting back to the decorative fixture. He half expected the old man to turn his head, following their progress. David jabbed him in the ribs. Ow, what? Xander said. David was pointing. The wallpaper had been peeled away in 4 thin, horizontal furrows. The rips were as long as Xander's arms. One end in a bunched up wad of wallpaper, at the end of the other 3 furrows. Rippled strips of paper hung like tails of rats. Claw marks, David whispered. Maybe, Xander said, but that's exactly what they look like. They were a few feet from the first door. It was 6-paneled and stained dark brown, like the others in the house. On the front of the door handle was a face, a scowling man whose tight lips appeared ready to open for a hearty reprimand. The brass plate under the handle was etched in the same intricate pattern as the carpeted runner. The impression of an old hotel was so strong in his mind, Xander was mildly surprised that no room number was affixed to the door. Well, what do we do? David whispered behind him. I'm thinking. He had a mind to knock, another remnant of a hotel milieu. Or maybe he thought politeness would spare him the wrath of whoever might be lurking on the other side. Instead, he turned the knob and pushed open the door. A small room lay within. A single domed fixture in the ceiling cast the room in a harsh, bright light. Xander pushed the door further until it stopped against the left-hand wall. He could see through the crack between door and frame on the hinged side that no one was waiting to jump out. Xander stepped in. David hung back, putting more than a hair's distance between them for the first time since they saw the figure downstairs. He looked up the hall in both directions, apparently decided that being in this strange room with Xander was better than being outside it without him, and then stepped in. A wooden bench ran the length of the hall. A wooden bench ran the length of the wall on the right. A shelf with a series of heavy brass coat hooks below it was above the bench, slightly higher than Xander's eye level. Hanging on the hooks was the accoutrements of a day at the beach. A man's bathing suit, a colorful beach towel, swimming fins, snorkel, a mask. A beach umbrella extending from bench to ceiling leaned into a corner. Next to the umbrella, 2 blue and white flip-flops sat side by side. Opposite the entrance was another door. It felt like they were in kind of a mudroom. Xander stepped into the inner door. Slowly, he gripped the handle. It's locked, he informed David. You mean from the other side? Xander looked at the handle. There was no keyhole, no deadbolt, or even hardware on the door. Even the hinges must have been on the other side, for they were invisible to him. He tried the handle again. It was as solid as a dock's mooring cleat. If it could be unlocked only from the other side, then it must be also locked from that side. The implication hit Xander like a plank inside his head. He pressed his palms against the door, holding it shut. He swung his face around to David. "It's locked from the other side," he said, almost hissing out the words. "You can't unlock it from this side. That means there's somebody in there," David finished. "Can you see anything under the door?" David dropped. He pressed his cheek against the wood floor. "Nothing. It's all black." Xander kept leaning into the door, sure something was about to push through. He tilted his head to put an ear against the surface. Something on the other side scraped at the door, and he said, "Get out! Go! Now!" David scrambled up. He backed through the open door into the hallway. "Xander?" he said, sounding like he was ready to cry. Xander came off the door. He backpedaled out of the room, pushing the door shut as he did. His grip remained tight on the handle. At last, he let go and backed away. He and David stared at the door a long time. "What'd you hear?" David said. "Scraping." Do you think it was him?" "I mean, it has to be." David scanned the other doors down the hallway. "You want to check on the other doors?" "Why?" Xander asked. "If he's in this one, he's not in those. Maybe we'll find something to help us." David was the video game player of the family. He tended to think this way, strategically. When Xander got stuck on Halo 3, David jumped in and methodically checked each possibility until he found the answer. Xander doubted snapping a beach towel at a figure would do any good, but tools or weapons, now that was another story. At the very least, they might be able to determine the size of the locked room by examining the other rooms. He wasn't sure exactly how that information could assist them. He didn't think didn't the hero in every movie, from war spectacles to horror flicks, gather intelligence about its opponent? Often the solution lay out in outwitting the bad guys, not overpowering them. "Good idea," he said, and he stepped past David to the next door. It was on the other side of the hall from the first. Before he could open it, David stopped him. He gestured towards the first room that they looked into. "What if he comes out of there while we're in here?" Xander didn't even have an answer. "You want to go back downstairs?" he said. "Do you want to go to bed?" David shook his head. Xander opened the door into a room precisely like the first. The bench, the shelf, the second door set into the opposing wall. The only difference were the items left behind. There was a white parka with a fur-lined hood, goggles, binoculars, a white canvas bag adorned by a fat red plus sign. Propped into the corner was a pair of beat-up skis. Beside them on the bench were what appeared to be Xander's untrained eye, 2 sticks of dynamite with long fuses. Wrapped in thin paper, stains showing through. "Nitroglycerin," Xander thought. "Are those real?" David asked him. "I don't know, but don't touch them." "What's with all this stuff?" David asked. Xander shook his head. "It's like a closet for storing a few things you'd need for one activity. The beach stuff in the other room, I guess alpine things in here." "Dynamite?" Xander just shrugged. "Why?" "David, I'm seeing this for the first time too, just like you." "Well, let's check the door." The second door was locked, as the one in the other room had been. He tried to force the doorknob to turn. Clockwise, counterclockwise, it didn't budge. His body rocked as he attempted to rattle the door. It didn't move or make a sound. "I mean, how? It's impossible," he said. "There's not somebody in that room too, is there?" "I sure hope not," and he put his ear against it. He pulled back fast, almost ran, but didn't. "It's the same sound," he whispered. "Fingernails?" David said, moving towards the corridor. Xander listened again. It's more like wind, something blowing around in the wind. Sand, maybe? Leaves? Twigs? Well, does it lead outside?" "It can't," Xander said. "I've inspected the outside of the house. There are some dormer windows in the attic, but nothing like this. Definitely no doors." "Is it a real door?" David said. Xander stared at him, thinking, like, maybe it's not a door at all. As David had done earlier, Xander got onto the floor and took a look under the door. It doesn't look like it just stops there. Remaining on his knees, he looked around. He rose and stepped to the skis. His hand was inches from them when he stopped. What if it was a trap? What if every item was booby-trapped somehow? He pulled his hand away, and to David he said, "Give me your pajamas." "They're my pants," David protested. "I'll give them right back." David tugged at the drawstring, unraveling a bow. He pulled them off. In only boxers now, as Xander was, he hesitated, and then handed over his pajama bottoms. The material was thin and lightweight, as Xander had expected. He dropped to his knees again and began pushing one of the pant legs under the door. "Hey," David said, "I just want to see if there's space on the other side of the door, or if there's a wall. I told you I'd—" The pajamas ripped out of his hands. They zipped under the door and were gone, so fast their final moments were a blur. Xander jumped back. He crashed into David, who had already spun halfway out of the room. Xander grabbed him and shoved him towards the stairwell. "Go, go, go," he yelled. So good. I love this book. Chapter 24, Saturday, 12:41 a.m. The brothers tripped and banged into each other as they flew past the door and into the Play-Doh wall light. At the landing, David tromped down. Xander turned to look back. Nothing was after them. "Wait," he said. David stopped. "Are they coming?" he asked. Xander shook his head. "Who was that? What happened to my pajamas?" He was slowly reascending the stairs. Xander looked at his palms as if for clues. They were just pulled out of my hands. So somebody was in the locked room. Xander thought about it. Somehow, the way the pajamas vanished didn't feel like someone had yanked them away. There was kind of a breeze when it happened. Yeah, anything moving that fast is going to make its own wind. No, not like that. I mean, right before they disappeared. Well, so what now? Xander smiled. "We keep looking." And he started down the corridor. "Well," David said, coming up behind him, "if you want any more clothes, use your own boxers." And he chuckled at that. "Yeah, that's funny." And both of them kept their eyes on each door as they passed. The first one, and then the second. They reached another wall lamp, and this one completely different from the last. It appeared to be half of a large ornate goblet, lead or pewter maybe. There was a flat base, a stem that reassembled a vine-entwined column, and a chalice inlaid with colored glass pieces, cut like gems. Light not only poured from its open top, up the wall to the ceiling, but also gleamed through the colored glass. He saw now that each fixture was different, but he could tell at this distance what each one resembled. The next room they entered was much like the first two. A bench, shelf, locked second door. The theme of the items had something to do with war. There was a smooth, round helmet, binoculars, black, not white as the ones in the Alpine room were, a gun belt with bullets in a holster, but no gun. On the bench was a hand grenade. Xander nudged David. "Don't touch that either." They went from room to room, finding the same arrangement of bench, shelf, hooks, and locked door. The items within reflected a wide range of activities, from mountain climbing to boating to something to do with hunting. Several times, Xander and David were at a loss for what the items meant. They reached the end of the long hall and the final door. "I counted 20, Xander said. David nodded. "I lost count after 12. Xander noted that the wall at the end of the hallway was not mirrored, but decorated to match the side walls. The landing at the other end, where they had started, seemed so far away. To make their investigation complete, they stepped through the last door. Hanging from the hooks were the props from a costume play. A round shield, battered and bent, a simple helmet, equally scarred, a scabbard with a sword's hilt extending from it, a net made of steel links, and what appeared to be an animal pelt. Xander tried the interior door, knowing what he would find. It was locked, and when he turned away, his heart leapt into his throat. David was holding the scabbard and pulling the sword from it. "David, don't touch it." His face was beaming. "Why not? This is so cool." Xander grabbed his brother's hands, preventing him from pulling the short sword all the way out. "Well, it might be a trick," he said, and he listened for any sounds that might reach him from the hallway. No doors clicking open, no footsteps. David watched him listen without saying a word. They stood like that, both boys and only boxers, sword and scabbard held between them, for a long time. It did not escape Xander how strange it was that he was more worried about the props. than about their intrusion into the rooms. Xander, rooms were rooms. A man's tools, his weapons were a part of who he was, part of what he did. To Xander, his camera was more about him than his bedroom. He did not know in what way, but he suspected the items in these rooms were more important than the rooms themselves. Because of that, if there was a trap, he believed the spring, the trigger, would be among them. With a stillness, a quiet, he began to relax, and he released his brother's hands. David, spooked now, did not move, and he said, "What is it?" Xander smiled, and he nodded towards the sword. "Let's see it." It came out of the scabbard with a metallic shing. David held it up. The blade was 2 feet long, thick, tapered to a fine point. It was dinged and scratched with rust and... "Is that blood?" David asked, staring at it. "It's stage blood," Xander said with more certainty than he felt. David rotated his wrist, circumscribing a figure 8 in the air with the tip. Xander cautiously plucked the helmet off of the hook. He hefted it in his hands, and he said, "Man, this thing's heavy." It felt gritty under his fingers, as though it was rusting or had been laying in the dirt. He checked inside, then fitted it over his head. David laughed. "Gluteus Maximus, I salute thee." Xander pulled the metal net off of its hook. It, too, was heavy, even heavier than the helmet. About the length of the sword, it was formed into a tube, open at both ends, but wider on one side than the other. Leather straps were attached to the wide end. He understood what it was. He stuck his arm into the tube up to his shoulder. His hand popped out the other end, where a metal band crossed over his palm. He tugged on the straps and cinched the ends together like a belt under his opposite arm. "Whoa," David said. Xander flexed out his chest and held up his arm. "It's chainmail," he said. His arm almost immediately felt the strain of the chain's weight. He lowered his hand, resting it on the locked door handle. "I know what all this..." The handle rotated under his palm. He fell to the floor as the door clicked open. David screamed and dropped the scabbard. He squared himself to the other door. He held the sword in both hands, extending his arms before him. Xander scrambled up. He stood next to David. Light, sunlight, streamed through the 3-inch opening. Nothing on the other side interrupted the flow of light. No shadows cast by beast or man as they prepared to push through. A sound, not dissimilar to the wind in the trees, reached their ears. Beyond it was a muted rumble, like distant surf. "Xander?" David said. That spurred Xander to move. He approached the door. He cocked his head to see through. It was only light. He reached out and touched the edge of the door and pulled it open. David sucked in a sharp breath. Beyond the threshold was nothing that could be a part of the house. It was a vast landscape of sand. An unfelt wind whipped the grains into spinning dervishes that danced for a few seconds before settling again. New torrents sprang up in different spots. Nearby, rocks broke the surface of the dunes. They huddled low, as if avoiding the stinging of flying sand. The heat of midday sun radiated over the boys. Impossible, Xander thought. It must be about 1 o'clock in the morning. Here, anyway. Certainly not in there. Sand blew in. Xander felt it hit his legs and then his stomach and chest. It was drifting in, obscuring more and more of the hardwood floor. He stepped closer and put his hand on the doorframe. He stretched his leg past the threshold. "Xander, don't!" David yelled. "I'm just seeing," he said over his shoulder. He pushed his bare foot into the hot sand. It sank in 1/2 inch. This was no hallucination, though he didn't really think it was. Was David seeing it too? Xander released the doorframe and took another step. He was completely out of the little room now. "Xander!" David screamed again. Xander looked back, grinning at the wonder of it all. And then the door slammed shut. Chapter 25. Saturday, 1:11 a.m. David couldn't believe it. "Oh, no, 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 no." He tossed the sword aside and leapt for the door, both hands on the handle. It turned. He tugged at it and opened it. 6 inches, no more. Something seemed to be tugging back, and he lost an inch of the opening. Every muscle strained to pull the door open. Xander! Xander! He raised his foot and pressed it into the wall beside the door. Pulled. Quickly, he moved one hand from the knob to the edge of the door, wrapping his fingers around the other side. Then he moved his other hand. He felt the heat of the sun, the tickling of the sand on his fingers and his ankle. Where was Xander? Wouldn't he be calling? Wouldn't he push from the other side? Grunting and straining with everything he had, he lost another inch of the opening. 4 inches. His knuckles were close to the edge of the doorframe. His hands were white, the blood squeezed out of them. If he eased up now, if he took a breath, the door would slam shut, taking 8 of his fingers with it. The door closed further. No! Now the muscles in his legs and his arms, even his stomach, were burning in pain. The door pulled in further. His vision blurred as tears filled his eyes. With a scream of anguish, he snapped his fingers out from the narrowing crack, and the door slammed with a solid bang. Despite his muscles feeling stretched like taffy, he seized the door handle, and it would not turn. Oh no, His sounds were cries and calls and groans all at once. He tugged, but the door held firm. He dropped to the floor, held his lips to the gap, and screamed, Xander, can you hear me? In the little room, individual grains of sand began rolling across the hardwood floor towards the gap. More and more sand disappeared under the door. Believing it signaled some kind of finality, David slammed his hand down onto the sand, and he felt it grating against his skin. It slid out and flew beneath the door. No! He laid his forearm in front of the gap, wedging it between door and floor. Sand whipped around his elbow and away. It formed a drift against his arm and then sailed over. Some pushed under. He lay down in front of the gap. He felt the instant tug of the wind like a vacuum. His boxers fluttered, trying to follow the sand through the gap. The grains kept flowing past, faster and faster, until he felt and saw no more than the suction coming from the gap. And it stopped. He flipped himself around and held his eye to the base of the door. The light beyond faded and went black. So good. Chapter 26. When Xander first looked back, David was standing in the small room. He was holding the sword out in front of him. Panic made his eyes wide. The streaming sunlight made his skin pale. He mouthed Xander's name. Xander recognized the movements of his mouth, but did not hear the word come out. The wind was howling out here. Then a funny thing happened to his vision. David, in fact, the entire rectangle of the threshold and everything it framed rippled. It wavered as though superheated air had passed between Xander and his brother. Then the door slammed shut, silently and instantly. The frame and door rippled again and then simply vanished. He was staring at endless sand, mountains in the distance. The roaring surf sound grew louder, and the mountains rushed in at him. Surprised, he covered his face with his arm and took a step back. He tripped and went down. Peering over his forearm, he witnessed the mountains become something else. First, they elongated into stone cliffs, and then faster than a heartbeat, they formed into stadium bleachers. In another heartbeat, the bleachers were crowded with people. The roar was theirs, loud cheers, unrestrained enthusiasm. Reposed on one elbow, he rotated his head. The stadium completely encircled him. The rocks nearest him shimmered and became a body. It was cut and bloodied. The other rocks he had seen from the small room did the same, until more than 24 corpses were scattered around the sandy stadium floor. The sand itself took on a darker tint, as though a cloud had rolled over the sun. It was darker around the bodies and severed limbs. Xander knew it was hued not by shadow, but by blood. The top level of the stadium was lined with ornate columns. Above them, wood poles held canvas awnings, which flapped in the wind. He recognized this place. It was the Roman Coliseum. His father had shown him pictures, but the crowd did not sit in the ruins he had seen. The highest level of the oval was unbroken. The surfaces were crisp and polished, throwing back the sun in 100 places. was the was when the Coliseum wait, when was the Coliseum finished, he thought. He tried to remember. The Emperor Titus had ordered the inaugural games in the year 80, not long after Jesus Christ was crucified. Xander pushed himself onto his knees. The tone of the crowd changed. From within the victorious rumble came a gasp of surprise. Xander stood. He glanced around. Sure enough, the portal was gone. Guess I was wrong about where you could end up. Not quite a football field, but close. The crowd closest to him began an angry chant, Sine Misone, Sine Misone. And they pointed at him, raised their hands, and then pointed again, as if lashing at him with whips. The chanting and whipping of hands was picked up by more and more people, sweeping the stadium in two directions, outward from the section that had started it. Sine Misone, Sine Misone. Xander followed its progression, as clear to him as the Terminator line between night and day was to astronauts. As he rotated, his eyes fell on the only other living man in the arena. His back was turned against Xander. His arms were raised as he received an ovation of stomping feet and raised voices. Flowers and petals rained down before him. One hand held a sword, the other a shield. He started strutting back and forth, pumping his sword and shield into the air. Then he caught the change of the crowd, their shift from joy to anger. He stopped. He scanned the stands on his side of the stadium. Sine Misone, Sine Misone. He spun and spotted Xander. He lowered his arms. He tossed back his shoulders, the gladiatorial equivalent of a bull digging his hoof into the ground, Xander decided, and the man strode towards him. He thinks I'm an opponent he missed, Xander realized. And he looked like one, almost naked, wearing a helmet and chainmail. He held out his hands. Wait, he yelled. Hold on. This isn't what you think. I don't belong here. The gladiator was 30 yards away. He showed no sign of stopping. He began waving his sword in the air and then clanged it against his shield, and the crowd roared. Xander backed away. He tripped over something. His cheek hit the dirt. A dead man stared at him from 2 feet away. The top of his head had taken a severe chop. It was cleaved at his eyebrows. Xander screamed unintelligibly and got to his feet. The gladiator was 15 yards from him, moving fast. He clutched a long-stemmed rose in his teeth. The red petal fell with each of his thunderous steps. I said wait, Xander pleaded. The man spat out the stem. Morere oneste scaleste, he said. Wait, what? No, wait. The gladiator was so close now, Xander could see the oily sweat that covered his body, the innumerable scars, the splattered blood from his victims, the green pulp from the stem dribbling down his chin. I'm just a kid, Xander yelled, and he turned and ran all out to the curving wall of the arena. He found a wooden door the size of a garage entrance and pounded on it. Help! Help! Where's the portal? How do I get back if the portal's not where it dropped me off? The thrumming of the crowd rose in pitch. Xander spun to see the gladiator charging him, sword raised over his head. Xander dropped straight down. The man brought the blade down. It thunked into the door. Xander darted out from under him. He felt a sandaled foot strike his thigh. He fell and kept moving, crawling in the dirt. He got his feet under him again. He did not look back, but stayed low and shot away. His feet lost traction, but he dug in and ran. He glanced back. He'd put some ground between them. The man jogged towards him, a practiced pace that conserved energy. Xander spotted a canopied area in the stadium. Flags and brightly breastplated soldiers surrounded several people sitting in wide, ornate chairs. One of them must be the emperor or governor or senator, somebody important. He ran for them, waving his arms frantically. Please, please, I don't belong here, please. Whoever the toga-clad man in the VIP section was, he seemed to take notice and seemed to understand him. He stood suddenly, his white, closely trimmed beard turned to a hairy frown. Please, Xander yelled. The man turned to a soldier, barked out an order. The soldier stepped forward, raised a spear, and hurled it at Xander. Xander turned his shoulder away just as it sailed past. He glared at the long shaft of the spear, wobbling in the effort of piercing the ground. Another soldier threw another spear. Xander dodged, and it impaled the body lying in the dirt. He got the message. No talking to the audience. He darted away before another soldier used him for target practice. Okay, guys, I'm going to torture you a little bit. I'm going to stop there, and you'll just have to wait for tomorrow for the other part.